Welcome back to my disembodied voice. Since I was a kid growing up in the 1970s, there's been one genre which appealed to me no matter what my age. And that genre is the good old British cop show. Now, be it Dixon of Dock Green, Z-Cars, The Sweeney, no, not that one, this one, The Bill, A Touch of Frost, Luther, Life on Mars, Ashes to Ashes, and even the recent Netflix entry Department Q, the British cop show has been a mainstay on our screens for, well, as long as we've had screens, really. Now, whilst Dixon of Dock Green and Z-Cars were hardly gritty dramas filled with sociopathic and alcoholic detectives, by the time we get to The Sweeney, we see TV attempting realism for the first time in police dramas, as the police were hard drinking, rough fighting, perp punching lunatics who were even more unstable and psychologically damaged than the people they were chasing. And rightly so. The 1970s were a truly horrible time to live in the UK, and as TV reflects the world we live in and we are drawn to mirrored worlds through the safety of our TV screens whilst we eat on our couch, the days of the convivial and avuncular Bobby on the beat were long gone, and nobody wanted to watch things like Dixon of Dock Green anymore. And over the years, through numerous incarnations, the grizzled British cop continued to evolve through various dramatisations, but in the end, they always seem to have one characteristic which makes us love them. They are all train wrecks. Now, a brief diversion for context. Maybe it was because I was unwell, weak, picked on at school, or the fact that I was not very strong as a kid and I liked avatars of mechanisms to project myself onto, but for someone who was treated quite cruelly at school and having been in unpleasant situations where I was powerless, like being mugged, I've always liked seeing bad people get their just desserts and justice being served. It's why I was drawn to the British TV cop show, because I love that "have it, you slag" people who got no rights at all when they were finally caught and got a taste of their own medicine. And as British cop shows are gritty portrayals of realism where horrible people do horrible things but were brought down by cops who bent the rules and went postal because that was the only way to get things done in a corrupt city, seeing scumbags being brought down a peg or two by someone who plays by their own rules is really rewarding. But more than that, the characterisation and focus on life outside of the station makes these guys whole as we understand who they are, admire their dedication to a job which will ultimately kill them, be it by a mad gunman or through general alcoholism, and the all-rounded portrayals of their lives at home as well as at work show them trying to hold together a personal life whilst mentally atomising into self-destruction on the job. We love flawed characters, but we also love coppers who'll do whatever necessary, including breaking the law they serve, if we know that the villain is truly reprehensible and deserves to go to prison. And whilst the Americans have had their fair catalogue of maverick cops, heck, I grew up watching Cagney and Lacey in the 1980s, as well as the truly excellent The Equalizer. No, not that one. I mean the late great Edward Woodward. Oh, and I know he wasn't a police officer. I know he was a former government agent, but he fought justice and despised corruption. So the grizzled maverick cop kind of fits to him as well. Anyway, basically, I love police shows and I just relate to them. However, despite American cops being just as maniacal as ours, I wanted to show why the British cop is so beloved because of the characteristics and qualities of being British, such as our stiff upper lip and stifled emotivity, and how, even in the very tame TV drama The Bill, which is now cancelled sadly, and I say tame compared to what is now Department Q and Luther, but even in The Bill, DCI Frank Burnside was a blue-eyed maniac who embodied everything about British cop culture, and he endeared himself to the British public by his blatant hatred of paperwork and modern policing, and just loved to get his hands dirty. So, whilst American cops are worthy for exploration, for today's video, we're going to look specifically at the British cop and ask, what makes them tick? Why do we love them? And how do they entertain us, and what kind of psychological scars are these guys carrying? So join me as we look at the psychology of the maverick and rogue British cop, and as ever, we'll be using a flow-through chart. And today's topics are the paradox, the karma, the PTSD, the personality. Right then, let's crack on. Oh, but before we go any further, spoilers ahoy for Luther, Department Q, Life on Mars, and any other show we cover today. So, you have been warned. Now, as we know, police are there to protect and serve, and it's important that we differentiate between corrupt cops and maverick cops who play by their own rules. And that's because the great British copper has to have one characteristic that remains intact no matter what happens in the show, no matter how bad things get, and no matter how dark the series goes. And that is the paradox. Our flawed but complicated protagonist can be a monster without restraint, but always displays love, dedication to the job, and their moral compass must be pointed at decency. When we first meet John Luther in Series 1 of his eponymous show, he is chasing a male through an abandoned factory. Anyway, it turns out that Luther's trying to save a young girl who's been hidden in a box with limited air, and the villain, Henry Madsen, is a pathological liar and a vile human being. Anyway, Luther loses his rag, Henry slips and falls, but rather than save him, Luther makes sure the woman is saved before letting the darkness consume him and making sure that Henry falls to what he hopes will be his death. This event becomes the catalyst for the whole show as we skip the internal investigation and pick up with Luther rebuilding his life after suspension. We find out his marriage has fallen apart. He was considered a hazard by his seniors, but all of his colleagues still have a deep and reverential respect for him. Over the course of the next 3 series, we then see Luther go from someone who means well but has no tolerance for evil, slowly manipulate, denigrate, and subvert the law as he brings some of the worst serial killers in London to justice. However, despite his frequent trips to the dark side, which are only ever aimed at the miscreants and evil killers, he never stops loving his wife, even after her death, is gentle towards the ladies in his life, helps a young girl escape a crime family who have no problem opening up young females and seeing what they look like inside, and even going toe-to-toe with a severely disturbed murderer whilst his female victims are in the room and terrified. Overall, despite his internal darkness, he always does what is right for the public and those he loves, and he never once physically hurts someone he loves. Yeah, he loses his temper and destroys a door when he finds out his wife has a new boyfriend, but his genuine love and gentleness for Zoe is the heart and soul of Series 1. In Series 2, with Zoe now passed away, he becomes sworn protector to a young lady called Jenny, and by the time he meets Jill Valentine from Resident Evil in Series 3, he tries everything to forge the nice relationship with a nice girl, but who John Luther is will always make domestic life a complete impossibility. He cannot mix his job as a policeman and the way he is at work with who he wants to be at home. The paradox is crucial when it comes to the British copper because without devotion to the law, the love of their family and partners, the tenderness and decency towards victims, all you have is a bent and dirty copper. And throughout the years in British cop shows, the moral compass must always point towards decency. Otherwise, without it, we cannot forgive the extreme needs and bending of the law so they actually get the result they want. In Luther Series 3, when he's finally reported for all of his wrongdoings and his past starts to catch up with him when the police complaints and investigation team come in to bring him down and put him in prison, we, the viewer, need to see these good guys, the investigatory team that's going to protect the public from bent cops, as actual bad guys. Because we know that Luther has saved lives and banged up monsters when the law was failing or he was stymied by a stuffy and outdated procedure. So, again, we have another paradox. The good guy investigation team actually need to be portrayed as the bad guys, and Luther, the aforementioned bad guy who's being investigated, needs to remain the good guy, because at the end of the day, he needs to protect people, and we need to be able to excuse some of his truly unpalatable acts so that he gets the bad guy and we can justify it in our heads. And that's because if John Luther had no moral compass, like his colleague Ian Reed, who accidentally kills Luther's wife and causes a young woman to get her tongue cut out and then disemboweled, all we have is a reprehensible man who, lost amidst a station full of selfish and bent coppers, offers us no character or moral depth. We as the viewer know right from wrong. We know when the police overstep the mark, but we can empathise with that when we see children killed or know that the criminal is going to get away with the crime. And whether it's a British stiff upper lip thing or a human need to seek justice, we all watch TV and know we would feel safer if there was a DCI Burnside, a John Luther, a Gene Hunt, or someone out there who goes through hell and bends the law to get the bad guy, but much like Gene Hunt when children are vulnerable or a young woman is at risk in Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes, he will be as gentle and caring as humanly possible when he isn't bashing criminals up with his fists. And that's all because we can empathise with the paradox. After all, who hasn't had the conversation about, what if someone hurt your children or raped your wife? You know that, despite the confines of the law, you'd want your own emotive and violent justice, and the rogue cop offers us that vicarious representation of such a dilemma on the screen, and that's why the bad boy cop is so adored. They have only one limit, and that's decency and slavishness to the law and the innocent they protect. As far as the criminal goes, there are no limits, and they'll go as far as necessary to get justice. The appeal of psycho police characters in UK dramas likely stems from a blend of psychological intrigue, relatable struggles, and the allure of complex characters. These policemen often represent a darker side of law enforcement, grappling with their own personal demons and moral compromises, which adds depth and tension to the narrative. Audiences may find themselves drawn to these characters because they offer a fascinating glimpse into the human psyche, even if it's a disturbing one, and the actors who often portray them with great nuance and charisma are just that, charismatic, and they have great depth, and we fall in love with them. But there's even more detail to why we love a maverick cop. So before we move on, let's recap why we love the paradox of the dark and brutal cop who plays by their own rules. Intrigue and psychological depth. Police characters with a dark side provide a unique opportunity for exploring themes of morality, justice, and the blurred lines between right and wrong. Their internal conflicts and struggles can be highly compelling and make the characters more relatable to viewers. Relatable struggles. Whilst they may have disturbing traits, these characters are often depicted as flawed humans who are struggling with personal issues, trauma, or a past that has shaped them. This relatability can make the audience empathise with them, even if they're not sympathetic. The good versus bad dynamic. The contrast between the bad aspects of these characters and the good aspects of their policing work can create a dynamic tension that keeps audiences engaged. The challenge of seeking the good in a flawed character can be entertaining and rewarding for the viewer. A glimpse into the dark side. For some, the appeal may stem from a fascination with the darker aspects of human nature and the potential for evil within law enforcement. Dark side police characters allows viewers to explore these themes without necessarily condoning them. Even readers of Arthur Conan Doyle's detective fiction of Sherlock Holmes may agree that Holmes displays a number of dark and borderline psychopathic traits, such as narcissism, coldness, and the tendency to get bored easily. And, as fans of BBC's Sherlock TV series recall, Sherlock himself once said, "I'm not a psychopath. I'm a high-functioning sociopath." Holmes could have said that he's a successful psychopath, the kind whose psychopathy is more socially and culturally adaptive and less likely to be channeled into criminal behaviours. In Life on Mars, Gene Hunt is almost certainly a sociopath, as he nearly kills criminals at multiple points in Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes. And in Netflix's Department Q, Karl Mork isn't a sociopath or a psychopath, but his mental unravelling is pushing him closer to a self-destruction that's getting beyond help. However, as I stated before, to make our maverick cops more heroic and have even more character, they need something else apart from the paradox, and that's the next stage of our flow-through chart, and that is the karma. Our rugged, abrasive, and sometimes brutal cop needs a polar opposite to stop them when they go too far, or be that reminder of why they need to set an example. John Luther has Sergeant Ripley, his understudy who, until Series 3, idolises him without question. Ripley is an idealist, a copper who would never bend a single rule and is visibly shaken when he sees his superior step outside the law, but seeing the outcome, and whilst not approving of it, starts to understand it, and this helps entwine an odd relationship of yin and yang. By Series 3, when Ripley agrees to help bring Luther down, his crusade against his boss is only stopped when he is forced to enter the world of the paradox, and he sends a vigilante to prison. This vigilante is an old and infirm man who has a severely disabled wife, and only killed the waste of semen Jared Cass because Jared defaced and led an online slur against the memory of his deceased daughter. Now, yes, murder is wrong, and killing Jared Cass could be seen as an inappropriate form of justice, but it's framed as appropriate because Cass makes a truly horrible crusade against the family, and when Ripley follows the law and arrests the vigilante, you literally see the penny drop in his face of why John Luther sometimes bends the law and does right to save good people from being harmed. However, Ripley is the sensible, law-abiding and gentle man who acts as a brake mechanism and guardrail to stop Luther from going too far. And even in Department Q, Netflix's new Scottish cop drama, we have a karma in the shape of Akram Salim. Now, whilst I personally loved Department Q, I'm going to admit it does have its faults, but for me, the standout character is Akram, who, after being recruited as sort of an admin clerk, acts as an anchor to the PTSD-stricken and self-loathing car crash who is Matthew Good's Karl Mork. Karl is lost in his own PTSD and suffering an existential crisis, and his life is fast collapsing around his ears. However, Akram is far from simple too, and, as we find out when he's confronted with 3 armed crackheads or a bodybuilding thug twice his size, his life in Syria has taught him how to both fight and torture with a deft and sickening efficiency. Yet, despite Akram's propensity for sadistic torture to get information needed, he is well-dressed, taciturn, quiet, and offers words of wisdom during the brief times that he speaks. Whether it's praise, context, or just an opinion, he speaks only when he has something important to say, and, whilst Karl Mork slowly self-destructs throughout the series, Akram is there to either calm his panic attack or offer insight, and that takes the edge off Karl's self-destructive spiral. And there is no better contrast between their personalities, for example, when Karl beats up the man who threatened to throw his son into a gang of paedophile rapists, as Karl loses complete control and has to be brought back from the brink of murdering someone in broad daylight by his stepson, compared to Akram's torture for the muscle-bound thug who he pushes down the stairs and then calmly tortures him by manipulating his broken leg until the thug has no choice but to give in, and Akram merely takes out his pen and paper, stays in control, starts writing the confession down, and has a calmness and focus. It's everything Karl isn't, who, at that moment in time when Karl is beating someone up, has a blood-stained face, is baring his teeth, and is about to step into the realm of killing someone. Basically, that shows how Akram is the brake mechanism, how he is the guardrail, he is the yin to the yang that keeps Karl from going too far and allows the audience to see the perspective from someone else. Also, as a karma is essential, without them, all we would have is a station full of hypertensive, angry, and out of control cops with no frame of reflection, conflict, challenge, or an existential ballast to bring them back into line when they go too far. Akram is there to rein Carl in at times. He's also there to give that wisdom that sometimes the emotive limbic thinking doesn't allow us to have. And Ripley does the same in Luther. He's there at times to make sure that Luther doesn't go too far, or there's an alternative when he does. But our British cops, be it from the Sweeney to ITV's anodyne but charming A Touch of Frost to the existential nihilism of Department Q, all have one thing in common, and that's because of the job that they do. PTSD. Police work is statistically proven to expose officers to repeated traumas which, over time, stick to the brain like plaque sticks to teeth and causes maladaptive coping mechanisms. Dealing with disturbing experiences is a defining part of policing, and despite counselling being available, the cost of repeated exposure to trauma mounts up. In a recent UK study, over half of police surveyed said they had insufficient time to process incidents before being sent back out on the next call. And whilst a British stiff upper lip attitude may offer some respite, it doesn't cure or diminish the long-term effects of job-related PTSD. And the effects of PTSD can cause alcoholism, substance misuse, Alzheimer's disease, and other dementias that are the leading neurological disorders, followed by Parkinson's disease and epilepsy. PTSD can also create neuropathy. Neuropathy is a nerve disorder that also falls into this category and causes pain and numbness in hands and feet. Alcohol, drug use and tobacco are major triggers for these conditions, and daily psychological stresses of police work lead to long-term effects such as the above-cited problems. Now, when we add in male aloofness, as talking can be a sign of weakness, and our British cop is open to things like obesity, smoking, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, and suicide, as well as a high risk of cancer. PTSD also causes paranoia, flashbacks, anxiety, and causes the limbic system, the fight or flight centre which houses the amygdala, and it causes these to go into complete meltdown, and the best way to deal with the stress and blot out the horrors is by nihilistic coping mechanisms such as alcoholism. Life on Mars chronologised how police used to live, and it's no surprise many were obese and dying long before they should have done because of lifestyle, long shifts, poor diets, and bad health choices like cigarettes and alcohol binges. Yes, it was partly to male bonding and the 70s were different, but for cops on long shifts whose personal lives were in tatters, it was how they dealt with their personal demons. However, PTSD alters the brain, and this may help explain why our British police officers are like they are. After all, if your life was all around repeated trauma, late nights, distance from those you loved, chaotic lifestyles, and not being able to show sensitivity or emotional weakness, then you too will be like Karl Mork, Gene Hunt, John Luther, or even D.I. Jack Regan in The Sweeney, as you fit into a masculine world of just coping with barely coping at all, and, as well as being disillusioned with the world, exhausted by all the criminal scum out there. Your moral compass might be okay, but inside your head, things are changing. Parts of your brain are being affected, such as the amygdala. This area processes fear and emotions. Repeated trauma can lead to an overactive amygdala, making individuals more sensitive to threats and angry. At the end of Ashes to Ashes, we find out that a young Gene Hunt was killed as a rookie cop and is now ruling over some sort of limbo for dead coppers to go and sort themselves out. However, such is Gene's life of chaos as a policeman, even in the afterlife, that he is now permanently angry and has little time for any criminal, even if they turn out to be innocent, and his temper and lashing out is a sign of someone who has poor tolerance and over-responds due to being exposed to repeat trauma. Another part of the brain is the hippocampus. Responsible for memory and learning, the hippocampus can shrink in volume and function due to chronic stress, making it harder to form new memories and process existing ones. In Department Q, Carl Mork is a complete car crash of a person, and he is stuck in the moment he was shot and left for dead, and, blaming himself for his friend's paralysis, he simply relives the same memories and remains the same horrible person who ruins people's lives, alienates his colleagues, and cannot progress in therapy. A third part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. This area regulates emotions, impulses, and executive functions like planning and decision making. Trauma can lead to difficulties with emotional control and impulsivity. Okay, so emotional dysregulation. And every single British cop in this video essay has emotional dysregulation that leads them into moments of rashness and either puts their job under threat or creates problems in the investigation or consequences for them to deal with later on. And due to our British cops all being stressed out and living a life of danger, criminals, long shifts, and seeing people getting killed and having to break the news to relatives that their loved ones are dead, the long-term consequences of these aforementioned brain changes and also the perspective of seeing life from the hardest angles of misery, hard justice, trauma, repeatedly being threatened and acting like they are impervious to stress and living through repeated traumatic events, causes massive problems for an essential part of all of us, but especially for them, and that is personality. The pattern of characteristics across the whole matrix of the persona and irreversible changes to their subjective, phenomenal fields of reality. Now, when I say personality, I don't necessarily mean a personality disorder, as many well-rounded and functioning people are police workers, but regardless of that, some jobs take a very special type of personality to do. And it's not just being a police officer that takes a special type of personality. After all, being a nurse means dealing with death, vomit and faeces every day, and that isn't for everyone. And being an abattoir worker and repeatedly slaughtering animals is also a very challenging job on the psyche, and thus that requires a very special type of person to do. So, being a police officer requires a specific personality. You have to be a special type of person to do it, tolerate it, live through it, adapt to it, and flourish in it. After all, nobody starts out as the DCI lead in homicide. Most officers have to start out as beat cops, dealing with riff-raff on the street, being frontline in riots, and spending long hours getting abuse at work over very long shifts which go from morning to night, are draining, and show the lowest functioning parts of the human dregs of society. For our British cops in this video essay, though, they have been around and are seasoned veterans, and this means they are experienced. Luther, Burnside, Mork, Hunt, and even the likes of Jack Frost in A Touch of Frost have been working for many years and have intuition burned into every sense so they can see, smell and taste incongruences in the minute something happens. Now, our British coppers are never afraid to bend the law when the need arises. They operate on a line with criminality, but separated by their moral compass, badge, duty, kind-hearted nature and unwavering dedication to justice, as we said at the start of this essay. However, their personalities are all of a certain ilk, and traits of the personality disorder psychopathy are present. However, psychopathy isn't all bad, and much like an abattoir worker would need to shut off their emotions as they bolt gun cows and behead chickens, the British cop has to filter out the emotional sludge of weakness, empathy and other things if they're going to do their job properly. Their personalities must have humanity and compassion, but going back to the paradox, the great British cop needs to occasionally to go postal, have a dark side and be drawn to the darkness, otherwise they wouldn't be a cop and would just be working behind a desk as an accountant. So, for personality, psychopathy isn't really a bad thing. Criminal scholar Diane Falkenbach wrote about the role of psychopathic traits in police officers, and I'm not suggesting that police officers are psychopaths, but she wrote that to do their jobs, they need elements of psychopathy in their personality. Luther tricks and frames serial killers, slaps child molesters, and even hangs a thug off a balcony. Gene Hunt is 1970s cop personified and beats up perps, walks headfirst into a riot with nothing but his fists, and in Department Q, even Karl Mork tells his stepson that he has two sides, that he's two different people, and these two factions are inside him, and sometimes it's hard to separate the one who's the copper and the one who's the man who should be supportive at home. So police need self-centred impulsivity, which is associated with impulsiveness, aggressiveness and egocentricity, cold-heartedness, which is related to the inability to experience important social emotions like remorse, and fearless dominance, which is associated mostly with social dominance. And fearless dominance is perhaps the most curious of those three because it has sometimes been implicated in socially adaptive behaviours, such as acts of heroism. Fearless social dominance is present when people walk headfirst into danger to save someone from a fire, or do their job in a dangerous situation, or just save someone who is really in a hazardous scenario. And as far as traits of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder goes, even high-level managers in the National Health Service, which is our health service in Britain, have found to have traits of psychopathy when it comes to do their job, so it's no wonder that some coppers are riddled with it. For our British cops in dramatisations, though, it's vital and crucial, but also, whilst they may have traits of psychopathy, as I said, they must retain the moral compass, they must have the paradox, they must have that likeable centre that we know, even when they go dark, they're good people. Policemen have to lead hardened lives. They work long shifts, they have lots of trauma, they live in poor diets, they develop maladaptive coping mechanisms, and they live in emotional chaos. Now, British police cops on TV are caricatures and heightened portrayals of stereotypes, but it's important to remember that, be it Mork from the very modern Department Q, Gene Hunt from Life on Mars, or even Regan from The Sweeney, the portrayal on screen hasn't really changed. Police officers are dark, complex characters who have compartmentalised their trauma, find relief in alcohol or isolation, work long hours whilst their home lives deteriorate, and are loose cannons when pushed over the edge. It's worth noting that for Karl Mork in Department Q, he ends the series in a much better place as his achievements allow him to grow and mature, but with the mystery of who shot him still to be solved, I expect more personality atomization if they indeed make a series 2. And for Gene Hunt, even he had his limits, and that further endeared him to the viewer, and by the end, when he's left alone after helping Alex move into heaven with the rest of his crew, the actual devil losing out on his attempt at getting Gene Hunt's team moved into hell after shattering the world apart, we saw how isolation, being alone and being a tough guy was always going to be an unbreakable characteristic, as he said goodbye to those he loved, and he will now forever be alone, and that psychopathy characteristic can keep Gene Hunt decent, yet horrible, yet kind, and also brutal. He is a personality of paradoxes, but a genuinely lovable character who we all know kept us safe at night while we slept in our beds, and he was beating up the bad guys. The British cop has all the stiff upper lip and emotional rigidity of what being British means, but as their horror and hurt bleeds through their collapsing veneers, we see the vulnerability, and that's the real paradox and joy of them. They are monsters, but they're kind-hearted and decent monsters beneath their scruffy looks and alcohol-stained teeth. And it's worth noting that for many of them, their visages, their external non-verbal presentation represented how they were inside. Karl Mork is a scruffy, battered jacket-wearing loose cannon. Inside, he's disintegrating. Gene Hunt was nicotine-stained, hadn't washed for days. His clothes were a suit, but a fairly tatty suit. Again, representation of who he was underneath. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. So remember that psychology is cool. Please like, share and subscribe, as more subs means more vids, and even leave a comment or start a discussion, as healthy debate is always welcome on here. And as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.
You're nicked.